The most terrifying thing about power is how quickly it believes it cannot be questioned. The quiet neighborhood of Virginia Beach slept beneath a cold ocean wind just after midnight, while porch lights glowed softly across trimmed lawns and silent driveways. But inside a modest brick home at the end of Ashford Lane, former Navy Commander Caleb Morgan sat alone in his living room, reviewing paperwork beneath the warm light of a standing lamp, unaware that within minutes his peaceful home would become the center of a disaster fueled by fear, arrogance, and a single wrong address. Outside, 3 black armored police vehicles rolled slowly down the narrow suburban street with headlights dimmed low against the darkness, while Officer Travis Keller adjusted his tactical vest inside the lead vehicle, his jaw tense with the excitement of authority preparing to force itself into someone else's life. Dispatch confirmed possible narcotics suspect, Keller muttered while scanning the house number through rain-speckled glass. And although the information they received was incomplete and rushed, Keller had already convinced himself the man inside the home was dangerous before seeing a single piece of evidence. Inside the house, Caleb remained calm, dressed in gray sweatpants and a dark thermal shirt, a half-finished cup of coffee cooling beside him while old jazz music played quietly through a speaker near the kitchen, and scattered across the room were small details revealing a disciplined life built after years of service. Perfectly aligned bookshelves, folded blankets, framed family photographs, but nothing flashy, nothing suggesting the man sitting there once commanded operations in places most Americans would never hear about. Then suddenly everything shattered. Bright tactical flashlights exploded through the windows as pounding fists slammed against the front door hard enough to shake picture frames from the walls. Police department. Open the door immediately. Keller's voice thundered through the house with the force of someone already expecting resistance. And Caleb stood slowly from the couch, confused but controlled, his instincts instantly sharpening after decades of military conditioning. Imagine hearing strangers surround your home in the middle of the night while you have no idea why they are there, because Caleb could already feel something wrong in the rhythm of the officers outside, the rushed commands, the overlapping voices, the nervous aggression that comes when people mistake fear for control. Before Caleb could even reach the hallway, another violent crash echoed through the house as the front door burst inward and armed officers flooded the living room shouting commands over one another while flashlight beams swept across furniture, photographs, walls, and windows with chaotic urgency. And throughout the confusion, Caleb did exactly what years of discipline trained him to do. He raised his empty hands slowly and stayed completely still. "Get on the ground now." Keller barked while officers spread through the home, overturning cushions, opening drawers, and storming into nearby rooms without explanation. And Caleb stared directly at Keller with remarkable calm, despite the destruction unfolding around him. "Do you have a warrant?" he asked evenly. But Keller ignored the question entirely because men intoxicated by unchecked authority rarely like being reminded of procedure. One officer knocked framed military photographs from a hallway shelf, while another tore open cabinets in the kitchen searching for evidence that did not exist. And through it all, Caleb remained silent, watching carefully, memorizing faces, badge numbers, movements, every detail. Not because he was powerless, but because he understood something that officers did not yet realize. Panic destroys truth while patience exposes it. Keller stepped closer with visible contempt written across his face as rain hammered against the broken front door behind him. "Funny how calm you are," he sneered, assuming calmness itself must be suspicious. And Caleb slowly looked around at the home he spent years rebuilding after war before answering in a voice so controlled it unsettled everyone near him. "You came into the wrong house tonight, officer." The living room looked nothing like the peaceful space Caleb Morgan had walked through only minutes earlier, because now overturned furniture, shattered picture frames, and scattered books covered the hardwood floor, while cold ocean wind drifted through the broken front doorway carrying rain into the house. And through all of it, Caleb remained on his knees exactly where the officers ordered him to stay, calm enough to make everyone around him uneasy. Officer Travis Keller paced slowly through the wreckage with the confidence of a man convinced his badge protected him from accountability, occasionally glancing toward Caleb with open suspicion as officers continued searching every room in the house looking for evidence that did not exist. "Check upstairs again," Keller barked impatiently. He is hiding something. And one younger officer immediately rushed toward the staircase, while another dumped kitchen drawers onto the floor with hurried frustration. Caleb watched silently as years of carefully rebuilt peace disappeared room by room beneath people who never once questioned whether they belonged there in the first place. And despite the humiliation burning quietly beneath his composure, he refused to react emotionally because he understood something important from decades in military command. Once angry men gain control of a situation, they often reveal more about themselves than the person they are targeting. Imagine watching strangers tear through your home while treating your calmness like guilt and your silence like defiance, because Caleb could feel every judgment in the room before anyone spoke it aloud. The way officers looked at his dark skin before looking at evidence. The way Keller assumed danger simply because a black man lived alone in a quiet suburban house with discipline in his posture and confidence in his voice. Upstairs, one officer opened a hallway closet and froze briefly after noticing several neatly folded military uniforms stored inside protective garment bags beside old framed commendations and naval insignias carefully stacked on a shelf. Keller?" The officer called uncertainly from above, but Keller barely looked up from the living room while checking paperwork on his tablet. "Keep searching," he snapped dismissively, unwilling to let facts interrupt the story he already created in his head. Caleb slowly turned his eyes toward the staircase, hearing boots move through the second floor where photographs from deployments, retirement ceremonies, and military reunions lined the hallway walls, memories from a life he rarely discussed with anyone outside his family. Not because he lacked pride, but because men who truly carried responsibility rarely needed strangers to validate it. One officer stepped carefully into Caleb's home office where maps, books, and a folded American flag rested beside an old wooden desk. And sitting near the lamp was a silver-framed photograph showing Caleb standing beside several decorated naval officers aboard an aircraft carrier years earlier. But before the younger officer could study the image, Keller stormed upstairs and grabbed the frame impatiently, barely glancing at it before tossing it onto the desk. "Everybody wants to pretend they are heroes," he muttered sarcastically. Caleb closed his eyes briefly after hearing the frame strike the wood because disrespect hurts differently when it lands on things earned through sacrifice instead of things bought with money. Rain continued tapping against the windows while neighbors slowly gathered outside beneath umbrellas watching police lights flash across the quiet street. Phones already recording from across lawns and driveways as whispers spread through the neighborhood about the late-night raid at Caleb Morgan's house. "You still have not shown me a warrant," Caleb said calmly from downstairs, and Keller leaned over the second-floor railing staring down at him with growing irritation because Caleb's control was beginning to feel less like cooperation and more like silent resistance. "You do not give orders here," Keller snapped loudly, but Caleb's expression never changed because deep down he already recognized the truth Keller could not yet see. This operation was built on panic, sloppy procedure, and assumptions that would eventually collapse beneath scrutiny. Then suddenly one of the officers downstairs stepped toward Keller, holding a folded dispatch printout in trembling hands. His voice noticeably quieter than before. "Sir, I think there may be a problem with the address." The second those words left the young officer's mouth, the entire atmosphere inside Caleb Morgan's house changed because panic sounds very different when authority suddenly realizes it may have crossed a line it cannot uncross. Officer Travis Keller snatched the dispatch printout from the officer's hand with visible irritation while rain continued blowing through the damaged front doorway behind them. And for several tense seconds Keller scanned the address numbers silently as though staring hard enough at the page might somehow change what it said. "It is one digit off," the younger officer explained carefully while avoiding eye contact. "Dispatch updated the target location 20 minutes ago." And downstairs Caleb slowly lowered his eyes because he already suspected the truth long before anyone admitted it aloud. Imagine watching armed strangers tear through your home only to discover they were never supposed to be there in the first place. Because every overturned chair, every broken frame, every scattered memory suddenly carried a different weight once the mistake became undeniable. Keller crumpled the paper slightly in his hand before immediately hardening his expression again, because men consumed by ego often fear embarrassment more than wrongdoing. "We are already here," he muttered sharply. finished the search, and several officers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances because now even they understood the operation had shifted from law enforcement into something far more dangerous, pride trying to protect itself from accountability. Caleb remained calm despite hearing the order because years earlier during overseas deployments, he learned how quickly insecure leadership becomes reckless once control begins slipping away. Upstairs, another officer carefully opened a locked wooden cabinet inside Caleb's office and paused after discovering several Navy blue presentation cases containing military commendations, deployment insignias, and challenge coins engraved with elite naval units. And unlike Keller, the younger officer recognized enough military symbolism to understand these were not souvenirs purchased online or decorations invented for attention. "Sir, you might want to see this," the officer called quietly, and Keller stormed into the office visibly annoyed before stopping short after seeing the contents spread across the desk beneath the lamplight. One presentation case displayed a folded commendation letter signed by high-ranking defense officials, while another contained photographs of Caleb standing beside decorated naval commanders aboard military vessels years earlier. And suddenly the house no longer looked like the residence of a criminal suspect. It looked like the carefully organized life of someone who spent decades serving his country in silence. Keller grabbed one of the photographs and stared at it with disbelief before scoffing dismissively. "Anybody can frame pictures," he muttered. But his voice lacked the confidence it carried earlier because uncertainty had finally entered the room. Downstairs, Caleb listened quietly as officers moved slower now, speaking softer, opening drawers more carefully as the reality of the situation settled over them one painful detail at a time. Outside, neighbors continued gathering beneath umbrellas while blue and red patrol lights reflected across wet suburban streets. And several residents who knew Caleb personally began speaking to local officers near the sidewalk. "That man helped my husband after his surgery," one older woman insisted emotionally. "He is the calmest person on this street." Another neighbor pointed toward Caleb's home with disbelief. "He flies the American flag every morning." And slowly the public image Keller created inside his head began collapsing beneath the testimony of ordinary people who actually knew the man standing handcuffed in his own living room. Then one of the younger officers made another discovery that changed everything. Inside a desk drawer beneath neatly stacked paperwork sat a dark leather credential holder marked with the seal of the United States Navy along with recent federal security clearance. Documents still valid under Special Operations Advisory status. The officer's face visibly drained of color as he opened the identification carefully beneath the office light. And after reading the name twice to make sure he was not mistaken, he looked toward Keller with genuine fear for the first time all night. "Sir," he whispered quietly, "this homeowner is Commander Caleb Morgan." The moment the words "Commander Caleb Morgan" echoed through the upstairs hallway, the energy inside the house shifted so dramatically it almost felt physical, because suddenly every officer standing beneath those flashing lights realized the man they treated like a criminal had spent years carrying responsibilities far beyond anything they understood. Officer Travis Keller stared at the military credentials in stunned silence, while rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of his tactical vest onto Caleb's office floor, and for the first time since the raid began, uncertainty completely replaced arrogance in his expression. Downstairs, Caleb remained seated calmly beside the damaged living room wall, while officers moved more carefully now, avoiding eye contact as they slowly recognized the scale of the mistake unfolding around them. One officer quietly lowered his flashlight while another began picking up overturned books from the floor without being asked, almost as though guilt itself had started pushing against the room. Imagine having your home destroyed by people who never bothered learning who you were before judging you. Because Caleb could feel the emotional weight settling over everyone inside the house now that the truth had surfaced, and strangely, that truth hurt the officers far more than his anger ever could. Keller descended the staircase holding the leather credential case tightly in one hand before stopping directly in front of Caleb, and despite the obvious tension spreading across his face, he still refused to fully surrender his pride. "Why did you not tell us who you were earlier?" Keller demanded sharply, clinging desperately to the idea that Caleb somehow caused the situation himself. But Caleb slowly looked up at him with the controlled stillness of a man who had spent decades watching fear destroy weaker leaders. "Because your officers entered my home before asking a single real question," Caleb answered quietly. "And because a man should not need military rank to deserve basic respect inside his own house." Those words landed harder than shouting because even the younger officers standing nearby understood the truth behind them, that the entire operation had been driven less by evidence and more by assumptions no one bothered challenging until it became impossible to ignore. Outside, the neighborhood had transformed into a sea of flashing patrol lights, gathering residents, and phone cameras capturing every moment, while whispers spread from driveway to driveway about the decorated Navy commander whose home had been raided by mistake. One older neighbor stood near the sidewalk, visibly emotional, as she watched officers carry equipment back toward their vehicles. "That man helped rebuild homes after the hurricane last year," she told a local officer quietly. "He never even talks about his military service." Meanwhile, inside the house, another officer approached, Keller holding a tablet displaying updated dispatch records and GPS logs from the operation, and his voice sounded nervous enough to immediately tighten the atmosphere again. "Sir, dispatch confirmed the real suspect lives 2 streets over," he admitted softly. The correction came through before entry authorization. Keller's jaw tightened as several officers nearby exchanged uncomfortable looks because now the situation had evolved beyond a simple address error. It was becoming painfully clear the raid should never have happened at all. Caleb listened silently, while rain tapped against broken glass nearby, and ocean wind drifted through the damaged doorway, carrying cold air across the ruined living room. And despite the destruction surrounding him, his composure never cracked because men like Caleb learned long ago that dignity becomes most powerful when chaos cannot steal it. Then suddenly the distant sound of approaching engines rolled through the neighborhood outside, deeper and heavier than standard police vehicles. And several officers instinctively turned toward the windows as dark government SUVs slowly entered the street, one after another beneath the rain-soaked streetlights. One younger officer stepped closer to the front doorway and whispered nervously, "Federal plates," while Keller's face slowly lost what little confidence remained. Caleb finally rose to his feet for the first time since the raid began, calm and steady despite the wreckage surrounding him, and as the convoy stopped outside his damaged home, he looked directly at Keller before speaking in the same controlled voice that had unsettled everyone all night. "Now you are about to understand exactly whose house you entered." The dark government SUVs rolled to a stop outside Caleb Morgan's damaged home, with the slow, deliberate precision of people accustomed to arriving where chaos already exists. And within seconds, several men and women in dark federal jackets stepped into the rain, while neighborhood conversations immediately fell silent beneath the flashing police lights. Officer Travis Keller stood frozen near the center of the ruined living room, watching through the shattered doorway as one tall naval officer approached the house carrying a black umbrella that he never bothered opening despite the cold rain soaking his uniform shoulders. And the expression on Keller's face slowly shifted from uncertainty into something closer to fear, because deep down, he already understood the situation had moved far beyond local police authority. Caleb remained perfectly calm while federal personnel entered the home, carefully stepping around broken furniture and scattered photographs. And the moment the naval officer saw him standing beside the damaged staircase, his posture changed instantly with unmistakable professional respect. "Commander Morgan," the officer said firmly while extending his hand. "We came as soon as we were notified." And every local officer inside the house seemed to stop breathing for a second because hearing the title spoken aloud by another decorated serviceman made the reality impossible to deny anymore. Imagine standing inside your destroyed home while strangers suddenly realize the man they judged all night spent decades protecting the country they claimed to serve, because the silence filling the room now carried more weight than yelling ever could. Caleb shook the officer's hand calmly before glancing once around the wreckage surrounding them. Overturned shelves, shattered glass, soaked carpet, family photographs scattered beneath muddy boots. And for the first time all night a flicker of sadness passed quietly across his face, because this house was never just property to him. It was peace rebuilt after years of war. Who authorized entry after the address correction? The naval officer asked while looking toward Keller, and immediately several local officers lowered their eyes because nobody wanted responsibility attached to what happened inside that house. Keller attempted to regain composure by straightening his tactical vest. "We acted on an active narcotics investigation," he replied defensively, but the confidence in his voice sounded weak now, almost rehearsed. One federal investigator stepped forward holding printed dispatch logs already highlighted. With timestamps, dispatch updated the corrected target address 23 minutes before forced entry, she stated calmly, and those words landed like a final crack spreading through already broken glass. Caleb quietly watched Keller's expression collapse piece by piece beneath facts that could no longer be argued away. And despite everything done to him that night, he still never raised his voice because men trained in command understand that truth becomes most powerful when delivered with outrage. Outside, the neighborhood crowd had doubled in size as more residents gathered beneath umbrellas recording the federal convoy and whispering about the decorated Navy commander whose home had been raided by mistake. And somewhere across the street, an elderly veteran stood silently, saluting toward Caleb's damaged doorway while rain rolled down his weathered face. One younger officer finally stepped forward, unable to carry the guilt anymore. "Sir." Commander Morgan asked for the warrant multiple times. He admitted quietly while staring at the floor, "We never showed him one." And several federal investigators immediately exchanged sharp looks because now the situation was becoming not just embarrassing, but potentially career-ending. Keller turned toward the younger officer with visible anger, but before he could respond, the naval officer cut him off coldly. "This is no longer your scene, Officer Keller." Those words stripped the last illusion of control from the room. Caleb slowly walked toward the shattered front doorway where cold rain drifted across the ruined floorboards, and for several seconds he simply stood there looking at the neighborhood outside, the flashing lights, the frightened neighbors. The cameras recording every detail of the night his peace was destroyed by assumptions. Then, without turning around, he spoke quietly enough that everyone inside the house had to listen carefully. "I spent most of my life entering dangerous places so innocent people could sleep safely." And the silence afterward felt unbearable because every officer standing there understood exactly what he meant next without him needing to say it aloud. Rain continued falling softly across Ashford Lane, while federal investigators moved through Caleb Morgan's damaged home, documenting every overturned piece of furniture, every broken frame, every procedural failure that transformed a quiet suburban night into a public humiliation no innocent man should ever endure. And through it all, Caleb remained remarkably composed, standing near the shattered doorway with his hands resting calmly at his sides, while officers around him slowly unraveled beneath the weight of what they had done. Officer Travis Keller no longer looked like the aggressive leader who stormed into the house earlier, because now his shoulders sat lower, his jaw remained tense, and his eyes constantly searched the room as though hoping someone else might somehow absorb responsibility for the disaster unfolding around him. One federal investigator carefully photographed the destroyed living room while another reviewed body camera footage beside the staircase, and every few minutes a new detail surfaced, making the situation worse for the local department. Missing warrant verification, ignored dispatch corrections, failure to identify the homeowner properly, and repeated refusal to answer Caleb's lawful questions during the raid. Imagine spending years risking your life for your country only to stand inside your own home treated like a threat by the very system you once protected, because Caleb understood something painful in that moment. The medals upstairs, the deployments, the sacrifices, none of them protected him from assumptions made before anyone bothered learning his name. Outside, the neighborhood crowd continued growing despite the late hour, while reporters began arriving near the police barricades after hearing rumors about a federal response connected to a mistaken raid involving a decorated Navy commander. And bright camera lights now reflected across rain-soaked driveways where frightened neighbors stood whispering about how quickly ordinary life can collapse when power refuses to slow down and verify the truth. One younger officer approached Caleb carefully, holding a damaged picture frame he had recovered from the floor upstairs, and after a moment of hesitation, he quietly handed it back, with visible shame in his eyes. The photograph showed Caleb years earlier standing beside a group of exhausted servicemen on the deck of a naval carrier at sunrise, all of them younger than, carrying the silent expressions of people who had seen things they could never fully explain to anyone outside their unit. Caleb accepted the frame gently before looking at the cracked glass running across the image, and although his voice remained calm, sadness finally crept into it for the first time all night. "Some of those men never came home," he said quietly. The young officer lowered his eyes immediately because guilt becomes impossible to ignore once humanity enters the conversation. Meanwhile, Keller stood near the kitchen arguing softly with department supervisors over the radio, desperately trying to frame the operation as a procedural mistake instead of reckless misconduct. But every attempt sounded weaker now because too many witnesses, cameras, and federal personnel had already seen the truth firsthand. Then one of the investigators stepped toward Keller holding a tablet displaying synchronized dispatch recordings and body camera timestamps. "Officer Keller," she said firmly, "you acknowledged the corrected address update verbally before entry." And the silence that followed felt heavier than the storm outside because everyone in the room immediately understood what that meant. Keller had known. Caleb slowly looked toward Keller across the ruined living room while rainwater dripped steadily through the open doorway behind him, and for several long seconds neither man spoke, because sometimes disappointment carries more power than rage ever could. Finally, Caleb broke the silence with a voice so controlled it unsettled the entire room. "You were so certain I belonged to your version of danger that you ignored every opportunity to stop this." And Keller opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out, because there are moments when truth removes every possible defense. Outside, camera crews continued setting up beneath flashing emergency lights, while federal vehicles lined the quiet suburban street. And somewhere beyond the crowd, the first pale traces of morning slowly began pushing against the dark Virginia sky. Caleb glanced once more around the wreckage of the home he spent years rebuilding after war before quietly adding words that none of the officers there would ever forget. "The worst thing destroyed in this house tonight was not furniture, Officer Keller. It was trust." The first signs of morning slowly appeared above Virginia Beach as dark clouds drifted away from the coastline. But inside Caleb Morgan's ruined home, the atmosphere remained heavy with silence, guilt, and the growing realization that the damage done there could never be fully repaired with paperwork or apologies. Federal investigators continued moving carefully through the house, documenting every detail, while local officers stood off to the side speaking less and less with each passing minute. Because nobody wanted to say aloud what everyone already understood, this raid was never truly about evidence. It was about assumptions allowed to operate unchecked beneath the protection of authority. Caleb stood quietly near the kitchen counter, holding the cracked military photograph the young officer returned earlier. And for a long moment, he simply stared at the faces frozen beneath the broken glass. Men he once trusted with his life during missions no civilian newspaper would ever know existed. Imagine surviving combat overseas only to discover the deepest betrayal comes not from enemies abroad, but from losing faith in the people sworn to protect your own neighborhood. Because Caleb could feel that loss settling into him more painfully than the destruction surrounding him, Officer Travis Keller remained near the center of the living room while department supervisors spoke to him in low, urgent voices, and every now and then he glanced toward Caleb, as though searching desperately for some explanation that would reduce his own responsibility, but there was none left to find. One federal investigator approached the supervisors carrying a printed personnel file, while camera crews outside continued broadcasting live updates from beyond the barricades. And after reviewing several pages quietly beneath the flickering emergency lights, the supervisor's expression hardened noticeably. There were previous complaints, the investigator stated calmly. Excessive force concerns, profiling allegations, procedural violations, and suddenly several local officers nearby looked visibly uncomfortable because patterns become impossible to ignore once someone finally connects them together. Keller immediately tried defending himself again. None of those complaints were sustained, he argued sharply. But even his own voice sounded exhausted now because he could feel control slipping further away every second the investigation continued. Caleb slowly turned toward him with calm disappointment instead of anger. and somehow that made the moment feel even heavier because rage can be dismissed as emotion, but disappointment forces people to confront themselves honestly. You know what the hardest part is? Caleb asked quietly while looking across the wreckage of his home. It is not the broken door or the destroyed furniture. And everyone inside the room instinctively listened because his voice carried the steady gravity of someone who spent years leading men through fear without ever needing to raise his tone. It is realizing how quickly some people decide who deserves dignity before they know anything about them. Caleb continued softly, and the silence afterward felt unbearable because nobody there could honestly deny the truth behind his words anymore. Outside, the neighborhood crowd had grown large enough that local news helicopters now circled slowly above the subdivision, while reporters discussed the mistaken raid involving a decorated Navy commander whose home was entered despite corrected dispatch information. And across social media, the story spread rapidly as veterans organizations, civil rights groups, and military communities began demanding accountability from the department involved. One older federal agent approached Caleb respectfully, holding a phone. "Commander Morgan, the Secretary's office has already requested a full briefing by this afternoon," he said quietly. And several nearby officers visibly stiffened after hearing that, because now the consequences had officially moved beyond local headlines into national scrutiny. Caleb nodded once before setting the cracked photograph carefully onto the kitchen counter beside shattered ceramic pieces from a coffee mug knocked over during the raid. And for a moment his eyes lingered on the dark coffee stains spreading across the floorboards beneath flashing blue lights. Then one of the department's supervisors finally stepped toward Keller with visible reluctance and quietly instructed him to surrender his badge pending investigation. The room fell completely silent as Keller slowly unclipped the badge from his uniform and placed it into the supervisor's waiting hand. And although no one celebrated, the emotional shift was undeniable because karma had finally arrived not through violence or revenge, but through exposure, truth, and the collapse of misplaced authority. Caleb watched the moment without satisfaction on his face because men like him understood something most people never learn. Justice feels far less triumphant when trust has already been destroyed. By sunrise, the storm over Virginia Beach had finally passed, but the damage inside Caleb Morgan's home remained painfully visible beneath the pale morning light streaming through broken windows and the shattered front entrance. And although the flashing police lights outside had begun fading one by one, the emotional weight hanging over the neighborhood only seemed heavier now that everyone fully understood what had happened there during the night. Federal investigators continued interviewing officers near the sidewalk while reporters gathered behind barricades broadcasting live updates about the mistaken raid that had exploded across national headlines overnight. And throughout the growing media storm, Caleb moved quietly through the remains of his home, picking up fallen photographs, straightening damaged books, and collecting pieces of a life interrupted by assumptions made long before facts were considered. Imagine spending years rebuilding peace after surviving war only to watch strangers destroy that peace in less than 30 minutes because they decided fear mattered more than truth. Because every cracked frame Caleb lifted from the floor carried memories attached to it. Family gatherings, retirement ceremonies, old friends who never made it home from overseas missions, reminders of a life built through sacrifice rather than suspicion. Officer Travis Keller sat alone inside an unmarked department vehicle parked near the edge of the street, while investigators continued reviewing his body camera footage, and for the first time since the raid began, nobody stood beside him anymore. The officers who followed his commands earlier now avoided him completely because once authority collapses, loyalty usually disappears with it. Across the street, several neighbors quietly approached Caleb offering coffee, blankets, and help cleaning the damaged house. And their kindness carried a sadness that almost hurt more than the raid itself because they knew no apology could fully restore what had been broken there. One elderly veteran wearing a faded Marine Corps jacket stepped carefully onto Caleb's porch before saluting silently toward him, and Caleb returned the gesture with quiet respect because men who survive service often understand each other best through silence instead of conversation. Meanwhile, inside one of the federal SUVs, investigators finalized preliminary findings confirming that dispatch corrections were acknowledged before entry authorization, procedural safeguards were ignored, and racial bias concerns documented in prior complaints were never properly addressed by the department, and every new detail only deepened public outrage, spreading rapidly online. News anchors debated accountability while military communities expressed support for Caleb across social media, but the moment resonating most deeply with people was not the revelation that he was a Navy commander. It was the footage of him remaining calm inside a destroyed home while officers treated dignity like something he had to earn. Caleb eventually stepped outside onto the wet front lawn, where reporters immediately began shouting questions from behind the barricades, asking whether he planned to sue the department, whether he hated the police now, whether he wanted revenge against Officer Keller. And for several seconds, Caleb simply looked at the crowd gathering beneath the bright morning sky before answering with the same controlled voice that carried him through the entire night. "I spent my career teaching young men how to stay calm under pressure," he said quietly, "because panic makes people dangerous." And the crowd slowly fell silent around him. Then, Caleb glanced back toward the broken doorway of his home before continuing softly. What happened here was not caused by strength. It was caused by fear wearing authority like armor. Those words spread across television broadcasts and social media within minutes because they carried something more powerful than anger. They carried truth stripped completely bare. Nearby, Keller watched the statement from inside the parked vehicle with exhausted eyes, while federal investigators continued speaking quietly outside his window. And for the first time in his career, he could no longer hide behind procedure, reports, or assumptions. Because the entire country was now watching exactly what happens when unchecked bias enters someone else's home carrying a badge. Caleb stood silently on his front porch as ocean wind moved gently through the quiet street around him. And despite the destruction still visible behind his shoulders, there was something unshaken in his posture that none of the officers managed to destroy that night: his dignity. 3 weeks later, the house on Ashford Lane looked different from the night. Fear and arrogance tore through it, because the broken doorway had been repaired, shattered windows replaced, and damaged walls repainted. Yet some things remained impossible to restore completely, no matter how carefully people tried to rebuild them. The media frenzy surrounding the raid had slowly faded into newer headlines across the country. But inside Virginia Beach, the story still lingered in quiet conversations at grocery stores, coffee shops, and neighborhood sidewalks, because people who witnessed that night firsthand could not forget how quickly authority turned a peaceful home into a scene of humiliation simply because someone stopped seeing a black man as human before seeing him as suspicious. Caleb Morgan stood alone in his living room early one morning, adjusting a framed American flag carefully back onto the wall, while soft sunlight drifted through the windows overlooking the calm suburban street outside. And for the first time since the raid, the house felt quiet again, not completely healed, but breathing normally. Imagine spending years surviving dangerous missions overseas only to discover the hardest thing to rebuild is not a damaged house, but your sense of safety inside it. Because every creak in the floorboards, every unexpected knock at the door, every flashing light outside at night, now carried memories Caleb never asked to keep. Across the city, official investigations continued expanding as multiple officers faced disciplinary hearings connected to the raid, while Officer Travis Keller remained suspended pending federal review. And although many people online celebrated his downfall, Caleb never spoke publicly about revenge because deep down he understood something painful. One ruined career could never fix the deeper problem that allowed the raid to happen in the first place. One afternoon, a young black teenager from the neighborhood approached Caleb outside while he repaired part of the front fence damaged during the operation, and after hesitating nervously for several seconds, the boy quietly asked, "How did you stay so calm when they treated you like that?" Caleb paused before answering, because some questions deserve honesty more than inspiration. "Because panic would not have protected me," he said softly while tightening a bolt along the fence post. "And because dignity becomes even more important when someone is trying to take it from you." The teenager nodded silently, as though carrying those words somewhere deeper than memory, before walking back toward the sidewalk beneath the warm Virginia sun. Later that evening, Caleb sat alone on his rebuilt front porch, listening to distant ocean wind move through the neighborhood trees, while the American flag beside the doorway shifted gently in the breeze. And although scars from that night still lingered quietly beneath the surface of his life, There was also something else there now: clarity. He understood that what happened inside his home was never truly about one mistaken address or one reckless officer. It was about what fear becomes when people stop questioning their own assumptions and start confusing authority with righteousness. A black SUV eventually pulled into the driveway carrying one of the naval officers who visited the night of the raid. And after stepping onto the porch, he handed Caleb a sealed folder containing official apologies, restitution documents, and commendations recognizing Caleb's years of military service. Caleb glanced briefly at the paperwork before setting it aside untouched because validation from institutions mattered far less to him than something simpler: knowing the truth could no longer be hidden. As the sun slowly disappeared beyond the quiet Virginia Beach neighborhood, Caleb looked out across the same peaceful street where flashing lights and shouting once shattered the night. And in that moment, the silence around him finally felt different, not empty, but earned. Then softly, almost to himself, Caleb spoke the one truth the entire country seemed to learn alongside him after that night. The most dangerous thing a person can carry into someone else's home is not a weapon. It is certainty without humanity. And somewhere beyond the repaired walls, the restored photographs, and the fading headlines, that truth continued echoing far louder than the raid itself ever could.